Assalamu alaikum. Today the topic of our discussion is the transmission of impulses across a synapse. But before going into the detail of transmission of impulse, let's you should have a very basic concept about the synapse. What the synapse actually is. A synapse is basically a junction between two excitable cells. Now, what are excitable cells? Normally, the resting membrane potential is present in all the cells of the body, but action potential cannot be generated in all the cells of the body. Those cells in which the action potential can be generated are known as excitable cells. So, if there is a junction between two cells, if the junction between two cells which are capable of generating action potential, then that junction is known as synapse, or simply you can say it is a junction between two excitable cells. Suppose this is one excitable cell and this is the other excitable cells. Now the junction between these two cells is simply known as synapse. Synapses are of two types, chemical synapses and electrical synapses. Most of the synapses in our nervous system are of chemical type. There is one important difference between these two synapses. In chemical synapse, the impulse is transmitted only in one direction, but in electrical synapse, the impulse can be transmitted in both directions. The reason lies in their structure. So, first of all, understand the basic structure of chemical and electrical synapses. This is an simple example of a chemical synapse, and this is the simple example of an electrical synapse. What happens in chemical synapse? In chemical synapse, one neuron releases neurotransmitter substance which acts on the receptors present on the membrane of the succeeding neuron. In this way, the impulse can be transmitted only in one direction, because one neuron has the ability to secrete neurotransmitter and the other neuron has the ability to, has the receptors for the action of these neurotransmitters. This later neuron cannot secrete neurotransmitter at this site, and this neuron don't have receptors at this site. So that is why the impulse can be transmitted only in one direction in chemical synapses, and the impulse can be transmitted in two directions in electrical synapses. Why the impulse in the electrical synapse is transmitted in both directions? What happens in electrical synapse? In electrical synapse, the two neurons are linked. Their cytoplasm are linked through electrical windows known as gap junctions. These gap junctions allow free diffusion of ions in either direction. For example, ions can move from this neuron through these gap junctions into this neuron, and similarly ions can move from this neuron via these gap junctions into this neuron. This is the reason that impulse can be transmitted in electrical synapses in both directions. Now, here I have told you that impulse is transmitted only in one direction, from the presynaptic terminal of the preceding neuron to the postsynaptic terminal of the successive neuron. What is the benefit of this? The transmission of impulse in only one direction in chemical synapses allows it to reach to a specific goal. Due to one transmission in one direction, the impulse reaches to a very specific goal. This is the benefit of a chemical synapse. Now we are going to start the transmission of impulse across a synapse. Before, you should know the physiological anatomy of the synapse. As you already know, a neuron has three parts: zoma, which is the body of the neuron, dendrites, and the axon. Here I have drawn an anterior motor neuron. This part is the zoma or body of the anterior motor neuron. This single process which leaves the body this is known as axon, and these small processes which are projecting outward from the body, these projections are known as dendrites. Now on these dendrites and zoma of the neuron, 10,000 to 2 lakh presynaptic terminals are located. Look, these small lines which I have drawn here, these are basically presynaptic terminals which are located on the dendrites as well as the zoma. Suppose this presynaptic terminal is located on the zoma, but this and this, all these synapses are located on the dendrites. So on the dendrites and zoma of the neuron, 10,000 to 2 lakh presynaptic terminals are located. Out of these presynaptic terminals, 80 to 95% presynaptic terminals are located on the dendrites of the neuron, and the remaining 5 to 20% presynaptic terminals are located on the body of the neuron. Many of these presynaptic terminals are excitatory. It means when they stimulate the zoma or dendrite, they will excite the neuron, and many of these presynaptic terminals are inhibitory. It means when they are activated, they inhibit the successive neuron. Here a question arises: why the neurons in different areas of the central nervous system function differently? The answer lies in their structural differences. The different neurons of different areas of central nervous system are structurally different from each other. That is why they function differently. Now what are the structural differences between these neurons? This is the zoma. So different neurons differ from each other with respect to the size of the cell body of the neuron. This is the one structural difference, that different neurons have different sizes of cell bodies. That is why they function differently. Another difference is that different neurons have different lengths and size of axon. Since different neurons have different lengths and sizes of axons, that is why they function differently. This is another structural difference. Then another structural difference is the number of presynaptic terminals. Different neurons have different number of presynaptic terminals located on the dendrites and the body. That is why different neurons of the central nervous system function differently. So up till now there are three structural differences. One is the size of the body, the other is the size and length of the axon, the third one is the number of the presynaptic terminals. There is another structural difference, which is that the size, length and the number of dendrites. Different neurons have different sizes, lengths and number of dendrites. That is why they function differently. So if anyone asks you why neurons of different areas of central nervous system function differently, you will say different neurons of the central nervous system function differently because they are structurally different from each other. And now what are that structural differences? Size of the cell body, size and length of the axon, number of the presynaptic terminals, and the sizes, numbers and the lengths of the dendrites. Now let's move forward. When we look, let's see, these presynaptic terminals are basically making synapses with either dendrites or the zoma. So membrane of the zoma or membrane of the dendrite will be considered as postsynaptic terminal, and these fibers, they are considered as postsynaptic terminal. So when we look on the structure of synapse under electron microscope, what it actually looks like. So this is the electron microscopic structure of the synapse. This is the presynaptic terminal and this one is the postsynaptic terminal. When we look at the presynaptic terminal under electron microscope, we find that it actually resembles round or oval knobs. That is why Presynaptic terminals are also known as terminal knobs, synaptic knobs, buttons, or end feeds. All these names are due to its round or oval knob-like shape. Now, in the presynaptic terminal, two important internal structures must be considered. One is the terminal vesicles and the other is the mitochondria. Now, what are the functions of these transmitter vesicles and the mitochondria? These transmitter vesicles contain neurotransmitter substance in it, and when they release their neurotransmitter substance on the postsynaptic membrane, they will either excite or either inhibit the postsynaptic neuron. So this is the function of the transmitter vesicles, that they store the neurotransmitter substance. Now what about this mitochondria? As you already know, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So it provides ATP for the synthesis of new neurotransmitter substances. And these neurotransmitter substances, after synthesis, they enter the transmitter vesicles and are stored in it. And when the time comes, they release these neurotransmitter substances into the synaptic cleft, which is the space between the presynaptic and the postsynaptic terminal. It is usually of 200 to 300 angstrom width. Now we will discuss the mechanism by which these transmitter vesicles release their neurotransmitter substances into the synaptic cleft. Now this is the presynaptic terminal. This membrane, since this is the membrane of the presynaptic terminal, so this membrane is known as presynaptic membrane. On the inside of the presynaptic membrane, there are some dense structures. You can see here, there are some dense structures. These dense structures are known as dense bars. These dense structures are known as dense bars. On each side of dense bar, voltage gated calcium channels are present. Clear? On inside of the presynaptic membrane there are dense bars, and on each side of dense bar voltage gated calcium channels are present. When an action potential traveling through the axon reaches at this presynaptic terminal, voltage gated calcium channels are open. And since this space is the extracellular matrix and the interior of the cell is the intracellular matrix, as you know, concentration of calcium in the extracellular matrix is higher as compared to the concentration of calcium in the intracellular matrix. So when voltage gated calcium channels open after the arrival of action potential, calcium from this extracellular matrix will enter the cell through these voltage gated calcium channels. And when the calcium channels have entered the interior of the cell, there they activate a protein or enzyme. You can say calcium calmodulin dependent protein kinase. This is calcium calmodulin dependent protein kinase. As you know, whenever kinase is activated, it will phosphorylate something. Kinases as a group are phosphorylating enzyme. So whenever kinase is activated, it will phosphorylate something. Since this calcium is activating calcium calmodulin dependent protein kinase, so this will phosphorylate something. What is that something? That something is another protein which is known as synapsin. This protein is known as synapsin. Previously, this synapsin, it anchors these transmitter vesicles to the cytoskeleton of the presynaptic terminal. When calcium calmodulin dependent protein kinase phosphorylates the synapsin, these transmitter vesicles are released from the cytoskeleton of the presynaptic terminal. You can see these are released from the cytoskeleton of presynaptic terminal, and they move to the release sites on the presynaptic membrane. When they reach the release sites on the presynaptic membrane, these transmitter vesicles fuse with the cell membrane of the presynaptic terminal and release their neurotransmitter substance into the synaptic cleft. So this is the mechanism by which transmitter vesicles release their neurotransmitter substance into the synaptic cleft. So if anyone asks you how transmitter vesicles release their neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, you will say when action potential reaches the presynaptic terminal, voltage gated calcium channels are opened. As a result, calcium from the extracellular matrix moves to the interior of the cell. There it activates a calcium calmodulin dependent protein kinase, which in turn phosphorylates synapsin. When the synapsin becomes phosphorylated, transmitter vesicles are released from the cytoskeleton of the presynaptic terminal and they move towards the release sites on the presynaptic membrane. When they reach the release sites on the presynaptic membrane, they become fused with the presynaptic membrane and release their neurotransmitter substance into the synaptic cleft. Now, once the neurotransmitter substance is released into the synaptic cleft, then what happens next? This neurotransmitter substance is either going to excite the successive neuron or inhibit the successive neuron. But this does not depend upon the neurotransmitter that it will excite or inhibit the neuron. It depends upon the type of receptors present on the membrane of the postsynaptic terminal. If the receptors present on the postsynaptic membrane are excitatory receptors, they will excite the successive neuron. And if the receptor present on the postsynaptic membrane are inhibitory receptors, then the incoming neurotransmitter will inhibit the successive neuron. So basically it depends upon the type of receptors that the incoming neurotransmitter will excite or inhibit the successive neuron. Now, how these receptors use this neurotransmitter substance to either excite or inhibit the successive neuron? It performs its action in one of the two ways. Some of the neurotransmitter substance, some of the postsynaptic receptors directly gate the ion channels. So whenever neurotransmitter substance acts on the receptor, they open the gates of the ion channels, which leads to the change in membrane permeability and the excitation or inhibition of neuron. And some postsynaptic receptors don't directly open the ion channels. They take an alternate pathway through the activation of second messenger. Now we will discuss these two processes one by one with detail. Those receptors which directly gate the ion channels are known as inotropic receptors, and those receptors which activate a second messenger are known as metabotropic receptors. So whenever neurotransmitter substance binds with the receptor, so let's start first with the inotropic postsynaptic receptors. Suppose these receptors are inotropic receptors. When neurotransmitter substance binds with the inotropic receptor, surely it will open an ion channel. Now what are the types of ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane? There are two types of ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane: cation channels and anion channels. As the name indicates, when cation channels open, positive ions will move through these channels, and when anion channels will open, these channels allow the passage of the negatively charged ions. The cation channels allow the passage of positively charged, but mostly sodium ions and little bit potassium and calcium as well. So whenever positive ions will move, so whenever cation channels open, sodium will move, and whenever anion channel open, chloride will move. So let's suppose a neurotransmitter substance comes and it binds with the inotropic receptor, and as the binding of neurotransmitter substance with the inotropic receptors, what will happen? As you know, inotropic receptor can be excitatory or inhibitory. So if this inotropic receptor is excitatory, so then after the binding of neurotransmitter substance, this excitatory inotropic receptor will open the cation channel, and when the cation channel will open, which ion will move? Sodium ion. Sodium ion concentration, as you already know, is greater in the extracellular fluid as compared to the intracellular matrix. So when cation channels will open, sodium will move from outside the cell to the inside of the cell. When sodium enters the inside of the cell, then what happens? Normally the resting membrane potential of the body of the neuron is minus 65 millivolt. When sodium ions enter, this ion will cause this minus 65 membrane potential to increase toward a positive value, and when threshold will be reached, action potential is generated and we say that neuron is excited. So this is the process by which the excitatory inotropic receptors excite the neuron. Now discuss about the inhibitory inotropic receptor. Suppose this receptor is inhibitory inotropic receptor. When neurotransmitter substance binds with the inhibitory inotropic receptor, it will surely open an anion channel, and when the anion channels are open, chloride will move, and chloride concentration in the extracellular fluid is greater, so it will move from extracellular matrix into the intracellular matrix, and as the negative ions are moving to the interior of the cell, this already negative potential becomes more negative, and it becomes difficult to reach to threshold and generate an action potential. That is why we can say that neuron is said to be inhibited, because it becomes difficult for the neuron to generate an action potential after the entry of chloride. So this is the way by which the inhibitory inotropic receptor inhibits the successive neuron. So it becomes clear that it is not the neurotransmitter substance which excites or inhibits the successive neuron. It is basically the receptors which decide the excitability or inhibition of the successive neuron. This is first process. We have discussed about inotropic receptors. Now come towards the metabotropic receptors, that when neurotransmitter substance binds with the metabotropic receptors instead of the inotropic receptors, then what happens? Here is the postsynaptic membrane. This membrane is known as postsynaptic membrane, and these are metabotropic receptors. These are metabotropic receptors. This postsynaptic receptor has two components. One component is protruding outward into the extracellular matrix. This component is known as binding component because it binds with the neurotransmitter. The other component, it protrudes into the cell cytoplasm, and this component is known as intracellular component because it is inside the cell. When neurotransmitter substance binds with this metabotropic receptor, then what happens? First of all, you should know why we need this alternate mechanism, because when neurotransmitter substance act on this inotropic receptors, they open the ion channels. These ion channels remained open for a shorter period, so these are basically responsible for short-term changes in the neuronal excitability. If we want to bring long-term changes in the neuronal excitability, then these inotropic receptors are not sufficient. They will not induce long-term changes in the neuronal excitability because they open only for a shorter duration. So if we want to bring long-term changes in the neuronal excitability, we have to adopt an alternate pathway, and that alternate pathway is adopted through the activation of a second messenger, and that activation of second messenger is the task of the metabotropic receptors. So by the activation of second messenger, we actually induce long-term changes in the neuronal excitability. There are many second messenger systems. One of the most common second messenger system uses G protein as a second messenger. G protein complex is free in the cytosol. Since this is presynaptic, postsynaptic membrane, this is extracellular fluid matrix and this is intracellular matrix. So this is the cytosol of the cell. This G protein complex is free in the cytosol and it is composed of a large alpha subunit which is the activator of the G protein, to which smaller beta and gamma subunits are bounded. Besides beta and gamma subunits, guanosine diphosphate GDP, it is also bound to the alpha subunit. So it is a complex basically. This complex is free in the cytosol. When neurotransmitter substance is released into the synaptic cleft from the presynaptic terminal, it will bind on the metabotropic receptor. Which component? Binding component. When neurotransmitter binds with the metabotropic receptor, it induces a conformational change in that receptor, and as a result of this conformational change, a binding site is exposed on the intracellular component of the metabotropic receptor. When this binding site is exposed, this free G protein complex, it binds with that binding site. See here, this G protein complex, which was previously free, after the exposure of binding site on the intracellular component of the metabotropic receptor, it is bound to the binding site. After the binding of G protein complex with the binding site, alpha subunit along with guanosine diphosphate is separated from the complex. See here, this alpha subunit along with GDP has been separated from the complex, but the gamma and the beta subunits are still bound to the binding site. When the alpha and subunit along with the guanosine diphosphate has been separated, this alpha subunit releases its GDP. See here, this GDP has been released. This alpha subunit releases its GDP and its place is taken up by the GTP, guanosine triphosphate. So previously alpha subunit GDP complex is now converted into alpha subunit GTP complex. Now this complex is active and it will perform specific chemical actions in the postsynaptic neuron, which are divided into 4 groups. First action is that it will open certain ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane, but this opening of ion channels is not similar to this opening of ion channels, because in that case ion channels are opened for a shorter duration, but when alpha subunit GTP complex opens ion channel, these ion channels remain open for a longer period of time. So in this way we can induce long-term changes in the neuronal excitability. Other reaction which it performs is that it activates an enzyme known as adenylyl cyclase. This adenylyl cyclase converts the ATP and GTP into cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP. When ATP and GTP are converted into cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP, these cyclic AMP and cyclic GMP activate highly specific metabolic machinery of the postsynaptic neuron. It activates highly specific metabolic machinery of the postsynaptic neuron, and when that machinery is activated, long-term changes in the postsynaptic neuron are induced, including long-term changes in the structure of postsynaptic neuron. When long-term changes are induced in the postsynaptic neuron structure, neuronal excitability is changed for a longer period of time. So there are 2 ways. Up till now we have discussed 2 ways by which this alpha subunit and GTP complex induces long-term changes in the neuronal excitability. First, it opens ion channels for a longer period. Second, it activates highly specific metabolic machinery, and as a result long-term changes in the structure of postsynaptic neurons and neuronal excitability are induced. Another type of reaction which it performs is that it directly activates some intracellular enzymes, and when these intracellular enzymes are activated, they perform specific chemical reactions, and as a result of these specific chemical reactions, neuronal excitability is modified for a longer period of time. The last type of reaction which it performs is activates gene transcription. Whenever gene transcription is activated, more messenger RNA is produced. When more messenger RNA is produced, more proteins are produced, and when more proteins are produced, at last long-term changes in the structure and neuronal excitability of the postsynaptic neuron are induced. So this is the alternate pathway by which we can induce long-term changes in the neuronal excitability. This pathway by which inotropic receptors excite or inhibit the neuron, this is only the short-term process, and this is the long-term process. Now when the neurotransmitter is released, then what happens? Then the reverse process takes place. This GTP bound to the alpha subunit, it is hydrolyzed into GDP. So the complex of GTP and alpha subunit is again converted into GDP, guanosine diphosphate and alpha subunit, and this complex then binds again with the gamma and the beta subunits, and after the binding, this whole complex is again released into the cytosol and becomes free. And whenever the next neurotransmitter comes, then same reaction takes place, and when that substance is released, then reverse reaction takes place, and so on. So these are two processes by which the postsynaptic receptors control the excitability or inhibition of postsynaptic neuron. Now let's summarize these two processes. That postsynaptic receptors use following mechanisms for the excitability or for controlling the excitability or inhibition of postsynaptic neuron. First, if a postsynaptic receptor wants to excite the postsynaptic neuron, then what should it do? It should open sodium channels. So when sodium channels open, sodium moves inward and brings the resting potential to threshold, and action potential is generated. Second, it should decrease the conductance of chloride and potassium. When chloride conduction is increased, movement of chlorine from outside to inside becomes less, and the neuron membranal potential cannot become more negative, and as a result neuron cannot be inhibited. So the alternate mechanism available is excitation. So it should postsynaptic receptor which wants to excite, it should open sodium channel, it should close chloride channel, and it should also close potassium channels. And third process, it should increase the metabolic machinery of the postsynaptic neuron, and when the metabolic machinery of the postsynaptic neuron is excited, then the number of postsynaptic receptors which are of excitatory type, they are increased, and the postsynaptic receptors which are of inhibitory type, they are decreased. So when excitatory postsynaptic receptors are more than inhibitory postsynaptic receptor, they will ultimately excite the successive neuron. So by three processes, a postsynaptic receptor activates the postsynaptic neuron: by opening the sodium channels, by opening the chloride and potassium channels, and by increasing the metabolic machinery, so that excitatory receptors should be more than inhibitory receptors. If a postsynaptic receptor wants to inhibit the postsynaptic neuron, then what should it do? It should bring this -65 millivolt potential to a more negative value, so that reaching the threshold becomes difficult and action potential cannot generate. So this is the benefit of this small value of resting membrane potential. Normally we hear that resting membrane potential is minus 90 millivolt, but in the neuronal zoma it is minus 65 millivolt. It is less negative. The advantage of this less negative resting membrane potential is that when you increase this value to a more positive value, you can generate an action potential and excite the neuron, and when you decrease this negative value to more negative value, you can inhibit the neuron. So excitation or inhibition of neuron are possible due to this small value of resting membrane potential. So let's come back. We were discussing if a receptor wants to inhibit the postsynaptic neuron, what should it do? It should close the sodium channels so that sodium will not enter and action potential should not generate. It should open chloride and potassium channels so that chloride will move inward and potassium will move outward, and as a result of their movement, the resting membrane potential, which is minus 65 millivolt, it should become more negative and action potential should not generate. So the third mechanism is it should decrease the metabolic machinery so that excitatory postsynaptic receptors should be less and inhibitory postsynaptic receptors should be more so that neuron can be inhibited. So receptor activates by opening sodium channels, by closing chloride and potassium channels, by activating metabolic machinery so that excitatory postsynaptic receptors should be more. A postsynaptic receptor inhibits the postsynaptic neuron by closing sodium channels, by opening chloride and potassium channels, and by inactivating the metabolic machinery so that inhibitory postsynaptic receptors should be more than the excitatory postsynaptic receptors. Now move forward. More than 50 substances are believed to act as synaptic transmitters, neurotransmitters. We divide these substances into two main groups, the smaller groups and the larger groups. The smaller groups are named smaller groups, but the larger groups are named as neuropeptides. The smaller groups are rapidly acting and the neuropeptides are slowly acting. The smaller groups are responsible for acute responses of the central nervous system. For example, transmission of sensory impulses from the peripheral tissues to the brain and the transmission of the motor impulses from the brain to the peripheral tissues. This takes place with the help of smaller group of neurotransmitters, because this process requires rapid transmission, and the rapid transmission is due to smaller groups, and the neuropeptides are slowly acting. So processes which should take time, they involve neuropeptides. For example, long-term changes in the sizes of synapse, long-term changes in the number of synapse, long-term changes in the number of postsynaptic receptors, etc. Now few points about smaller group of neuropeptides. These smaller group neurotransmitters, these smaller groups of neurotransmitters are synthesized in the cytosol of the presynaptic terminal, and after synthesis they are actively transported inside the transmitter vesicles and they are stored there, and whenever the action potential arrives, these transmitter vesicles fuse with the membrane and release their transmitter substance into the synaptic cleft. After the transmitter vesicle has released its transmitter substance, it is recycled and used again and again. So what is the mechanism of its recyclization? When it fuses with the membrane, it releases its transmitter substance into the synaptic cleft. Then this vesicle, it becomes a part of the presynaptic membrane, and after that, after some time, this vesicle, which was the part of presynaptic membrane, it invaginates inward, and then it pinches off to form new vesicle, and when new vesicle is formed, then again neurotransmitter substances are actively transported into it. Then again it fuses, becomes the part of presynaptic membrane, invaginates, pinches to form new vesicle, then again this process is continued. So this process is continuous and it is continuously recycled and reused. Now discuss about the electrical events which occur during neuronal excitation and neuronal inhibition. When neurons are excited, what are electrical events taking place in these neurons, and when neurons are inhibited, what are the electrical events? So let's discuss these events one by one. First, I will talk about the electrical events which occur during neuronal excitation. So this is the presynaptic terminal and this is the postsynaptic terminal. This presynaptic terminal has released its transmitter substance into the synaptic cleft. Now it will bind with the postsynaptic receptor, and let's suppose this receptor is the inotropic excitatory receptor, means that when this transmitter binds, it will excite the neuron through the opening of ion channels. Clear? When this transmitter binds, surely it will open cation channels. When cation channels are open, this sodium ion, which was previously in high concentration in extracellular matrix, it starts moving rapidly to the inside of the cell, and when sodium ions enter the cell, they bring this less negative potential to a more positive value, or a less negative value, you can say more positive value. So membrane potential, which was previously minus 65 millivolt, now has become minus 50 millivolt. This is the change in the membrane potential which occurs due to the influx of sodium. This change in membrane potential to a more positive value is known as excitatory postsynaptic potential. Since this potential, it occurs in the postsynaptic terminal, postsynaptic membrane, that is why this potential is known as postsynaptic potential. Why this postsynaptic potential is known as excitatory postsynaptic potential? Because if this EPSP, excitatory postsynaptic potential, rises to a sufficient value that it can reach the threshold, then this EPSP will generate an action potential and will excite the neuron. Since this EPSP will excite the neuron after reaching at the threshold, that is why this postsynaptic potential is known as excitatory postsynaptic potential, EPSP. Now what is the threshold? The threshold for generation of action potential is minus 45 millivolt, but the resting membrane potential is minus 65 millivolt. So it means we have to bring a change of plus 20 millivolt to reach to threshold and generate an action potential. So an excitatory postsynaptic potential of 20 millivolt will be able to generate an action potential. So this is the electrical event which occurs during neuronal excitation. What is the electrical event? Production of EPSP. Now come toward the electrical event during neuronal inhibition. Suppose this neurotransmitter substance, it binds with, after release it binds with the receptor, and this time this receptor is the inhibitory inotropic receptor, and when this substance binds with the inhibitory inotropic receptor, it will surely open an anion channel, and when an anion channel is open, chloride will move inward. And make this minus 65 millivolt potential more negative until the Nernst potential for chlorine is reached, where the diffusion of the chlorine will stop. Whenever the Nernst potential of chlorine is reached, the movement of the chlorine is stopped, and until then this chloride movement continues, and it makes the minus 65 millivolt potential more negative. What is the Nernst potential of chlorine? The Nernst potential for chlorine is minus 70 millivolt. So it means when chlorine moves inward and the membrane potential reaches to minus 70 millivolt, the movement of chlorine stops. As you can see, the resting membrane potential, which is minus 65 millivolt previously, now has become minus 70 millivolt. So it becomes easy or difficult to generate an action potential. obvious it becomes difficult to generate an action potential. That is why we can say that this neuron is inhibited, and that change in potential from a less negative value to a more negative value, suppose minus 65 millivolt was previous and minus 70 millivolt is new, so the change is minus 5 millivolt. So this negative change in potential is known as inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Since this postsynaptic potential is going to inhibit the neuron, that is why this postsynaptic potential is known as inhibitory postsynaptic potential. One way by which IPSP is produced is the movement of chloride. At the same time, when this transmitter binds with the receptor, potassium channels are opened. When potassium channels are open, potassium will move from inside the cell to the outside, because concentration of potassium inside is higher as compared to the outside. So when positive ions move from inner to the outer side, negativity is created inside, and that membrane potential, which is already very negative, this movement causes it to become more negative. So we can say that movement of chlorine inward and potassium movement outward, they actually causes the membrane to become hyperpolarized, and when membrane hyperpolarized, it becomes difficult to generate an action potential, and as a result neuron is said to be inhibited. This type of inhibition is known as postsynaptic inhibition, because this type of inhibition is taking place at the postsynaptic terminal. If we want to inhibit the transmission of impulse at the presynaptic terminal, then this inhibition will be called as presynaptic inhibition. So now discuss about the presynaptic inhibition. When inhibition at postsynaptic terminal, it is known as postsynaptic inhibition. Another type of inhibition is there, and that is the inhibition at the presynaptic terminal. Before the signal reaches the presynaptic terminal, it is blocked, it is cut off in the way, and this inhibition is known as presynaptic inhibition. What is the mechanism of this presynaptic inhibition? In this presynaptic inhibition, inhibitory substances are released on the sides of the nerve fibrils before the signal reaches the presynaptic terminal. This is presynaptic terminal. The signal is coming in this direction. Before this signal reaches at this point, inhibitory substances are released at these sites, which will block signal at this site. Now in most instances, the neurotransmitter, the inhibitory substance which is released is known as gamma aminobutyric acid. Most commonly this inhibitory substance is released, which will inhibit the signal. Now how will it inhibit the signal? This inhibitory substance, when it is released on the sides of nerve fibrils, it opens anion channels in the membrane of the presynaptic neuron, and when anion channels are opened in the membranes of the presynaptic neuron, chloride will move inward and will bring the resting potential to a more negative value and the membrane to a hyperpolarized state, and as a result action potential would become difficult to generate and the neuron is said to be inhibited. So this is the presynaptic inhibition. Another very important concept is summation. You know that resting membrane potential is minus 65 millivolt and the threshold is minus 45 millivolt. So if we want to generate an action potential, we have to bring a change of plus 20 millivolt in the resting membrane potential. But when a single presynaptic terminal, it discharges on a postsynaptic terminal, only 0.5 to plus 1 millivolts EPSP is produced, but we want EPSP of 20 millivolt. So it means when single presynaptic terminal discharges on postsynaptic terminal, sufficient EPSP is not produced and action potential is not generated. So how the action potential is then generated? We stimulate multiple presynaptic terminals simultaneously. So when this is stimulated, it will contribute plus 1 millivolt in the EPSP. When this will stimulate, it will contribute plus 1 millivolt in the EPSP. When this will stimulate, it will contribute plus 1 millivolt in the EPSP. When this will be stimulated, it will contribute plus 1 millivolt in the EPSP. Similarly, many presynaptic terminals are stimulated simultaneously, and they will contribute in the excitatory postsynaptic potentials. And when the EPSPs of all these presynaptic terminals are added together, we get sufficient EPSP to generate an action potential. So this type of summation, in which summation means adding together, so this type of summation in which the EPSP is produced due to multiple sources to generate an action potential, this type of summation is known as spatial summation. Another type of summation is temporal summation. In temporal summation, we do not stimulate multiple presynaptic terminals simultaneously. There is only one presynaptic terminal and there is only one postsynaptic terminal. So let's discuss its mechanism. You know, when presynaptic terminal discharges on the postsynaptic terminal, it causes the opening of ion channels in the postsynaptic membrane. These ion channels remain open for 1 to 2 milliseconds, and during this period sufficient ions move inward to produce an EPSP, and when this EPSP is produced, it will last for 15 milliseconds, because after 15 milliseconds this EPSP will be declined and the resting membrane potential is restored. So up to 15 seconds EPSP remains produced in the postsynaptic neuron. So if during this period another impulse comes, it will produce another EPSP which will last for 15 seconds, and then another impulse during this period will produce an EPSP which will last for 15 seconds. Then if during this period another impulse comes, it will produce an EPSP for 15 seconds. So in temporal summation, what happens? Rapid discharges from a single presynaptic terminal will produce EPSPs in the postsynaptic neuron, which can be added together to generate an action potential. So this is temporal summation. In the end, what is electrotonic conduction? You know, action potential generates not in the body and the dendrites of the dendrites of the neuron. So this is neuron, this is its cell body, and these processes are dendrites, and this is axon. The presynaptic terminals are located on dendrites and zoma, but action potential does not generate in dendrite and axoma. This is generated at this point, the initial segment of the axon, which is known as axon hillock. Why the action potential does not generate in body and dendrite and it generates at axon hillock? Actually, there are not sufficient voltage gated channels in the dendrites and axons which will generate the action potential. But axon hillock has sufficient voltage gated sodium channels to generate an action potential. But we know presynaptic terminals are located on the body and the dendrite. It means the EPSP, which is produced as a result of presynaptic discharge in the dendrites and the zoma, it should move from dendrite and zoma to axon hillock, and when it reaches at this point, action potential is generated. But you know that dendrites do not have voltage gated sodium channels enough and they cannot generate action potential. So how EPSP, which is produced in the dendrites as a result of presynaptic discharge, it moves to the axon hillock. It moves, suppose, see this diagram, this is the presynaptic terminal and this is the postsynaptic terminal, and this is dendrite, this is cell body, this is axon, and this is hillock. So EPSP is produced at this side, so it should move from here through the zoma to reach the axon hillock. So how this conduction is made possible? Because action potential cannot be generated. So this EPSP, since action potential cannot be generated, so this EPSP is moved through the fluid of the dendrites by the movement of the ions to reach the body, and when it reaches here, action potential is generated. This type of conduction through the dendrites by the movement of the ions without generating action potential, this type of movement is known as electrotonic conduction. And there is one important concept related with the electrotonic conduction, and that is decremental conduction. What is decremental conduction? Suppose when presynaptic terminal discharges at this level, EPSP produced is 15 millivolt, but when it reaches at this point, the remaining EPSP is only 5 millivolt. So there is a loss of 10 millivolt excitatory postsynaptic potential as the EPSP moves from dendrite to the zoma. So this loss in EPSP, when the EPSP moves from dendrite to the body, is known as decremental conduction. So what is the cause of decremental conduction? Why decremental conduction occurs? The reason is that the dendrites are longer. They are longer, and their membrane is leaky to chloride and potassium ions. When the EPSP is passing through this dendrite, since this membrane is leaky to chloride and potassium ions, chloride will move from extracellular to the intracellular matrix, since its concentration gradient allows it to move in that direction, and the potassium will move from inside to the outside due to concentration gradient. As a result, negativity is created inside due to chloride influx and potassium outflux. Since EPSP is positive potential, so this negativity will partially neutralize the EPSP, and as a result EPSP potential is lost. This loss is known as decremental conduction. For example, if the EPSP previously generated was 15 millivolt, but due to chloride movement and potassium ions outflux, minus 10 millivolt negativity is created. So plus this minus 10 millivolt negativity will partially neutralize the EPSP, and the EPSP and the remaining EPSP would be 5 millivolt. So this loss is known as decremental conduction. And what is the cause? The cause is that the dendrites are longer and their membranes are leaky to chloride and potassium. So if the length of the dendrite is greater, there will be greater loss, because it has to travel a long journey, and during that long journey many chloride enters, many potassium ions outflux occur, and large negativity is created which will neutralize the EPSP. And if the length of the dendrite is short, decremental conduction will be less, because it has to travel a short journey, and during that short journey only few number of chloride and potassium ions movement occur to neutralize the EPSP. So this was all about the transmission of impulses across a synapse.